Let me first introduce our speakers. Mr. Leong Zheng is the Executive Director of Charities and Community at the Hong Kong Jockey Club. He's also the co-chair of the Hong Kong chapter of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Mr. Andreas Schleicher is Director for Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OSED. He leads the Yidan Prize for Education Research Judging Panel. Dr. Sobi Tao is Director of the Future of Learning and Innovation Team at UNESCO and leads the Futures of Education Initiative, an attempt to reflect on and generate debate about how education might need to be rethought in a world of increasing complexity, uncertainty, and precarity. Professor Rocky Tuan is Vice Chancellor and President of the Chinese University of Hong Kong and co-chair of the Hong Kong chapter of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Our moderator for this panel is Dr. Christopher Thomas. He is Director of Partnerships at the Yidan Prize Foundation and Social Entrepreneur in Residence at Stanford University's Graduate School of Education. Before joining the Yidan Prize Foundation and Stanford University, he was the advisor to the Education Global Practice at the World Bank. Dr. Thomas, I'm going to turn things over to you.
I am so pleased to be part of the Yidan Prize Foundation and its incredibly inspiring mission of building a better world through education. The Yidan Prize laureates and luminaries are bringing their expertise from the fields of neuroscience, psychology, economics, and technology to deliver a better education experience for children and young people around the world. This session is designed to give us a long view on education, to discuss how schools are preparing young people for the big challenges ahead. So, to read the news is to know that our world is prone to fracturing along environmental, social, and economic fault lines. Climate change, conflict, pandemics, inequality, they're often called existential threats to the well-being of the next generation. But to study history is also to understand the incredible progress that has been made in improving the quality of life in the last 50 years, and that can be attributed in large part to investments in education, research, and development. Increasing levels of education have helped people to become more productive, to build institutions, to invent and to adapt to a changing world. Education has helped people to escape poverty, to live longer lives, and to build the vibrant civic and civil spaces that we all enjoy today. It was the foundation of the East Asia miracle, as Eric referred to in his earlier talk, and of so much progress around the world. Our question here is, can education also be the winning formula for the 21st century? How is the world changing? And in response, should we change the way we think about educating the next generation? I am so pleased to have this incredible panel of distinguished thinkers on the future of education with us today. And just what a privilege it is to have us all together this afternoon. And I want to jump right in and start with Sobi Tao. You just launched a report called Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education, which Charles Chen Yidan referred to in his opening remarks. Can you tell us, why do we need to change the way we think about education, and what are the proposals you're putting forward in your report?
Thanks, Chris. First of all, a pleasure to be here, and let me take this opportunity to thank the Council of Luminaries of the Yidan Prize Foundation for their contribution to the work of the International Commission on the Futures of Education. So why we need to rethink our approaches. The report of the Commission was launched just last month and argues that education faces a dual challenge. The first challenge has to do with the fact that we're not fully delivering on past promises of universal quality education for all. And despite undeniable progress in educational development over the decades, we have still not ensured the right to quality education for all. Too many children, too many youth and adults are still denied meaningful educational opportunities, and particularly in the global South. In low-income countries today, 3 out of 5 adolescents and youth are not in secondary education. 2 out of 5 women are non-literate. A quarter of youth are non-literate in low-income countries, and this, by the most conventional measures of literacy. Even across the world, half of the students who are in upper secondary education don't complete the cycle. And we know the evidence on, significant shares of children and youth not achieving minimum proficiency levels in reading and in mathematics, despite their schooling. And so it is economically vulnerable and historically marginalized communities that continue to be excluded from the right to education. And all the emerging evidence that we have from indicates that the COVID-19 educational disruption is worsening what we often refer to as a global learning crisis. So the ways we organize education around the world really do not do enough to ensure just societies and shared progress that benefits all. So that's the first part of the dual challenge, the unfulfilled promises of the past. The second challenge has to do with the uncertain futures. And Chris, you mentioned some of those just in your introduction, the widening inequalities across the world, the increasing concentration of wealth among a few, democratic backsliding and growing polarization of societies in many parts of the world, the climate crisis and its consequences, its disproportionate consequences on countries in the South that have least contributed to the crisis. And then the fact that our relationship to information, data, and knowledge has changed profoundly over the past decade. And while there is, tremendous transformative potential in education, in innovation, technological innovation, digital innovation, there are risks, and the digital transformation of education needs to be steered if we want to ensure that it benefits all. So it is this framing of the dual challenge and a critical choice: continue on an unsustainable path or to radically change course. And the report of the International Commission argues that changing course requires that we rebalance our relationships with each other, with nature, and with technology. And that education is key to redefining our relationships with each other and the world around us. But education is caught between these unfulfilled promises of the past and these uncertain futures. So addressing the dual challenge and to help shape more just and sustainable futures, education itself needs to be transformed. And here the Commission proposes in broad strokes 3 aspects of the starting point, which is reframing what it means to be human, redefining our relationships with each other, with the living planet, and with technology. So on the first point, education needs to be transformed to redefine our relationships with each other, implies the need for pedagogies of cooperation, of collaboration, of solidarity, pedagogies that value and sustain diversity and pluralism. But we also need to unlearn bias, prejudice, and discrimination that plague all of our societies. The second, education must also be transformed to redefine our relationships with the planet. The ecological crisis requires curricula at all levels that fundamentally reorient the place of humans in the world. Environmental education, science education will need to be core components of education looking to the future. And finally, transforming education to help redefine our relationship with technology. Critical digital literacy is essential in the 21st century. But while digital technologies transform the work of schools and teachers, they cannot and should not replace them. And I think we've seen that clearly with the COVID, with the school closures and the education and the COVID disruption. The human dimension of education remains essential. The best algorithm cannot replace the social and emotional skills of teachers, their humanity, their empathy, their care, qualities that will be central to teacher development in the future. The curricula and the educational experience should support teachers and students to determine how best technology can be used and for what purposes. So these three dimensions in rebalancing are redefining what it means to be human, and how education can play its role in redefining our relationships to each other, to the living planet, and to technology.
Those are pretty profound challenges. Questions. What kind of reception are you getting? Are people ready to take up these very deep questions and challenges?
Obviously this is open to the invitation of the International Commission. It's a call for a new social contract for education, and that forging this new social contract needs to include everyone, and we do need these discussions happening at different levels and with different constituencies. There will obviously be different reactions. The report was only launched several weeks ago. The reactions we're getting so far have been quite encouraging, I would say. We often overlook the fundamental question of the why of learning. Much of the discussion on transforming education and the future is really about the what and the how of learning. As important as they are, we often overlook the why question. The reactions have been positive, but I would say from civil society partners, from academia, so far. The test will be the reactions we get from at the policy level and in terms of national education authorities. That remains to be seen. I think educators will find much of interest in the reports of the Commission, which actually goes in depth into issues of teaching and learning and pedagogy, perhaps much more than what the Delors report a quarter of a century ago did. So much more fine-grained discussion of teaching and learning, of pedagogy, of teaching, and the changing role of teachers.
Mm-hmm. Andreas, let me turn to you. At the OECD, you've spent many years building PISA, which is probably the most cited observatory of learning achievement around the world. You're also thinking deeply about the future of education and skills through the Education 2030 program. What are the skills and capabilities you believe children need to navigate their future? And thinking back on PISA, how far are we now from where we want to be, or even from UNESCO's longer-term vision?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. The knowledge and skills that we need for tomorrow will shape our world for tomorrow. In a way, we can say that the world we see around us today is the product of our education in the past. The knowledge and skills that we have produced, it has delivered, technology has delivered, rising living standards. But it's also resulted in a fair number of fundamental disconnects. The disconnect between the infinite growth imperative and, as Joey just explained, the finite resources of our planet, between the financial economy and the real economy, between the wealthy and the poor, between the gross domestic product and the well-being of people, between what's technologically possible and the real social needs of people. Those are the kind of results that we also need to sort of look at in education. So if we want to see a different world, we have to look at a different education, and the capacity of individuals to live with themselves, to live with people who are different from them, to live with the planet. And I think the most fundamental change is the one between the present and the future. At the moment, we have basically value system. I do whatever a situation allows me to do. Sustainable values are about, creating a better balance between the present and the future. I think that's perhaps the hardest challenge that we face today. It's visible in the way we deal with the COVID pandemic. It will be even more visible in the way we deal with questions around climate change. Can we see the bigger picture? Can we see the forest among the trees? Can we see the needs of people all around the world? Can we appreciate different ways of thinking, different ways of working, different cultures? Those are fundamental questions. But then they're also sort of, even in the key subjects that we talk about often, mathematics and science, fundamental changes will be required. Today, science, being good in science is no longer just about memorizing knowledge about, physics or chemistry. It's being able to think like a scientist. Can you design an experiment? Can you understand the world through a scientific lens? Or history. History is no longer just about, memorizing names and places. It's about being able to understand how the narrative of a community has emerged, how it has developed, advanced, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changes. And those things obviously are much harder to teach and to assess as well. And I can tell you from our PISA assessments, we are making great strides and great efforts here. Creative thinking is one thing that we're currently working on. We have looked at collaborative skills as well. So I think we need to find better ways to observe those skills. The emergence of social and emotional skills, some see them sort of as personality traits, but they are also outcomes of the way: empathy, trust, confidence, courage, leadership. They're also very important products of our learning and education environment. So I think we need to look at this in a very holistic way and understand that our schools today will be our economy and our society tomorrow. Those linkages are very clear. They work at the individual level. Never before had those with the right skills had the life chances they have today. And never before have those with poor skills faced the price for this they pay today. But it also works at the aggregate level. Whether you look at economic development, social development, whether you look at the distributional element, if we have a wide distribution in the knowledge and skills of people, we're going to see inequality and social and economic outcomes. I think when we design tomorrow's education, we need to look at those connections.
And can I ask both of you, when you think about those skills, very broad social-emotional skills, communication, the values around caring for the planet, caring for the environment, caring for your fellow person or fellow countryman, being a global citizen, some of those skills are learned in school and some of them are learned outside of school. How do you think about the partnerships, or how do you think they should evolve between schools, communities, and employers to try to build that future generation that we all want to see?
Yeah, I think we should maybe in the future think less about the institutional context and think more about learning. Today's schools are very good to keep students inside and the rest of the world outside. In the future, we should look at learning more as an activity, not as a place, and support it in many different ways. Technology certainly will help us in doing this. And I know the Yidan Prize Foundation has sort of supported lots of really interesting efforts in this area. But I think that's the important part, that we look at this ecosystem of learning. Learning is a whole of society enterprise. And actually it's always been. But we need to, in a way, what has happened in the last 20, 30 years, we sort of commodified education. Students became consumers of learning content, teachers became service providers, parents became clients, And I think that has created a distance between those different actors, and I think we need to bring them better together again.
Yep, perhaps just to come in on that, and agreed with Andreas on looking at learning as a process and not limiting it, to a specific space and time. And I think in the reports of the International Commission, one of the recommendations is really reconsidering education across times, all times and spaces. So this broader view. But I think important to also say that in reimagining our futures together, it's a reaffirmation of education as a public endeavor and a common good. It means that forging a new social contract needs the active involvement of all and strengthen partnerships at all levels. I mean, I mentioned pedagogies of cooperation and solidarity. It's really about building the capacities of students and teachers to work together to transform the world, building the capacities of individuals to work together, and a cooperation and collaboration that needs to be taught and practiced in appropriate ways at different levels and spaces and at all ages. It implies also for teachers that their work should be characterized by collaboration and teamwork, that quality teaching is produced by teams and enabling environments. So working with fellow teachers, working with subject specialists, working with literacy specialists, librarians, special needs educators, guidance counselors, social workers, and others. And when it comes to designing high quality learning experiences, there are many ways that teachers can collaborate with others through study groups, teacher councils, pedagogical teams, peer mentoring, coaching, observation, and site visits. But also, I think you were mentioning a strengthened partnership with industry and community leaders. And beyond cooperative pedagogies and collaborative teaching, industry and community leaders must be better brought into secondary and higher education, ensure that students are exposed to the world of work, to the range of professional occupations. And educational institutions shouldn't only provide career counseling, but offer educators, opportunities for lifelong learning, ensure that they are kept apace with changes in their profession and the world of work. In technical vocational education, secondary, and whether at the secondary or tertiary level, opportunities for work-based learning, providing students, learners with real-world experience, and that improves the quality and relevance of education and training, across the system. So strengthened, partnerships and collaborations, I would say, at all levels. We've seen, and Rukmini Banerjee also mentioned it as one of the takeaways from, from the COVID-19 disruption, is a closer link also between families and educational institutions, the teaching and educator community. So strengthen partnerships at all levels, and in the spirit of learning, not new, the concept of lifelong learning, but really re-emphasizing that learning is and needs to be articulated across a number of spaces across the lifetime, whether work related, but also social, cultural spaces, and the home.
Okay, so let me bring in Rocky and Lung, because you're actually, through the Sustainable Development Solutions Network in Hong Kong, you're trying to foster this kind of dialogue about what do these education goals mean in Hong Kong and the local context, and what are the practical steps you could be taking to move forward. So when you think about how education should change to serve Hong Kong's future, what issues come to your mind, and how is that dialogue proceeding in Hong Kong?
Thanks, Chris, for the question. So I'm going to start off maybe by giving you some of my thoughts on this whole pandemic business. I think what the pandemic has done has really revealed to us that the world is a very small place. It's basically a village where what one villager does will affect another villager and so on. So where rumors go almost immediately from one end of the village to the other. So that's the bad side of that the pandemic has told us. But at the same time, I started thinking about what a village really is. A village is a place where people have kinship. They are interdependent. They perhaps trust each other a lot. And they care about each other. They have some common values, tradition, and so forth and so on. I could go on and on. So I look at this as two sides of the same coin. So that the pandemic has told us now that we are actually a global village. So what can we do with this global village characteristic that we now have learned? I think one of the lessons we have learned, and I think previous speakers have already alluded to this, is we must collaborate. We must cooperate. Now, in military campaigns, they talk about strategic, tactical, and operational. That's just the strategic part. That's relatively straightforward to spell out. We have to cooperate. We have to do things together and so forth. But how do we do it? And what exactly do we do? And that's where the rubber meets the road. So I look at it this way. In my mind, you can't really cooperate unless you know what you are cooperating on. And I think that's where the Sustainable Development Goals come in. Right? The UN 17 SDGs, pretty much all countries of the world, most of the countries anyway, well, actually all the countries agree on the SDGs, but in reality, they agree on many, many of these things in practice as well. So we must use these as areas, as spotlights, as the operating ground for cooperation. Because if you don't know what you want to cooperate on, you will never cooperate. All you're going to end up doing is talk. And so that's where universities come in. That's where higher education come in. Because we're in the knowledge business. What we do is we disseminate knowledge, we generate knowledge, and we try to find ways to apply that knowledge. So I would strongly advocate that one of the roles of higher education in Hong Kong and everywhere else in the world is that we get together, we can hover around the SDGs, because I think that is actually a good starting point. And so the SDSN, and Leon can talk about this a little bit more on that, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network is to actually have institutions of higher education. Some kind of noise in the background. Somebody obviously agrees with what I just said. So it's to really use these SDGs and use institutions of higher education, such as universities and professional schools and so forth and so on, and to work on these goals so that we can get together and actually do things together. And that's what the SDSN, the Hong Kong chapter, plus 42 other chapters in the world, that's what we do when we get together. We actually talk about these things in very concrete ways. It is a beginning, I agree, I admit, but it's a great beginning, particularly in this post-pandemic, well, not quite post-pandemic, in this crazy pandemic world that we're living in right now. So, right. Leon?
Yeah, thank you, Rocky. Perhaps I can add a little bit onto sort of collaboration and how we think about collaboration. To begin with, I mean, I represent a foundation, basically. This is Hong Kong Jockey Club. It's a very unique institution in Hong Kong very uniquely Hong Kong, I think also, it's a non-profit, but obviously it generates a lot of profit because, we are the single largest taxpayer in Hong Kong. And for that matter, we are one of the largest foundations in the world as well. So we make up to US dollar equivalent 550 million donation a year. Now, the way we think about education and eventually how it gets into collaboration is really, when we think about education, we think about education as in three transitions. Right? So it is from childhood to adulthood. It is from an academic environment to a work environment. It is particularly on these days a transition to a new digital era. So to us, these are the three transitions we think about, and we say, okay, if our children are under these sort of environments or these sort of transitions, then how do we think about innovation? How do we think about training capacities in the schools or in the community? How do we think about new pedagogy? How do we think about curriculum, and etc. So as to think about also social inclusion even in these environments, so as to bring about a more sustainable ecosystem for the schools and particularly I think for the children. So to us, really, when we think about all these and trying to apply technologies and everything that I think different speakers talk about, alternative philosophies, etc., I think really mostly, not exclusively, but mostly we think that we can put our resources and collaborate with partners in four major areas. I think one is diversity management, which again, I think Dr. Rumini also talked a lot about that. So how do we think about learner capability? So in the same classroom, I mean, we all, I see some business people here, we must be thinking alike. When we think people or school children, we think of a normal distribution. But most of the system cater to 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviation. If you're outside of that, whether you're gifted or your special education need insufficient, the system is very difficult to take care of you. Right? So how do we think about ways that we can potentially build digital student profile so they can be better taken care of? They can, there's a more holistic understanding of the students from class to class. How do we think about, autistic kids, for example, and include them better in the mainstream education? I think the second dimension we think about is mental wellness. So this, again, is a huge, it's perhaps another pandemic ongoing. It is for a lot of cities the same challenge. It is definitely for Hong Kong a big challenge. The third dimension is really on digital literacy. So I mentioned transitioning to a digital era. We have multiple programs thinking about, in kindergarten, cool play, really nothing to give them device or anything, but to inspire them on problem solving already. We have programs, Cool Thing, that's for primary schools, kids. Michelle is also sits on our advisory committee, thank you very much. This program actually just the curriculum is the first Asian curriculum to be recognized by ISTE as a curriculum in STEM education. Now the last one is really then school to work transition. So again, we have multiple programs working with business sectors, working with the government, bring sometimes students to those environments, but sometimes also bring those environments to school. So to us, we have to open the schools up, again, echoing to what Rocky just mentioned, be collaborative and really work around the system so that more people can work together to deliver quality education for the children. Perhaps I'll stop here and see if Chris.
Maybe I'll just also add in terms of you mentioned digital literacy, which I think is absolutely critical. And I think there are two other types of literacy that we should pay attention to in this ever-changing world. One is cultural literacy, to really need to understand the context in which knowledge will be practiced and will be transmitted. The third one that I think is just as important is truth literacy. We are to some extent, because of social media and the not so quite good application of social media, we are sort of in the post-truth world. And I do believe that we have an obligation in education area to teach or to um, instruct our students how to tell truth from untruth. And I think that is a very difficult task, by no means easy. But I think in this post-truth world, very important. So I just add those two things to what you just said, Leon.
It struck me, I think, Rocky, you said something very simple but very profound in the beginning of your comments, which was we can't cooperate unless we know what to cooperate on. And I think that's a theme that runs through all of your work, Sobi, Andreas, and the panel discussions before. Have that discussion and building that consensus on where we want to go, and can we imagine an education system that is better than what we had before the pandemic, that serves the needs of those children who have been historically marginalized or are not doing well in the current system. I'd like to maybe go quickly around the room and ask each one of you, has there been a particular innovation in education that's very promising that you've seen that is working in the world today? And how could you bring that into the discussions that you're having? What's the most promising innovation you have seen?
Maybe I'll throw in what I've learned.
Sure.
And it's something that you learn by actually doing it, and then reiterating it and multiple times, and then you find the truth at the end. Is that unless the student has ownership in something, then all you're going to be doing will be passively pushing the student towards a place that he or she doesn't really care a whole lot about. So I think the idea of teaching a student to learn how to learn is absolutely critical. Now that said, every individual will have a different starting point. So we got to be very perceptive, very persistent, and to be very clever. But to somehow let the student figure out, oh, I discovered this, therefore I own it, and then the process will go much smoother. So we started something a couple years ago, which is very generally called Grand Challenges of the 21st Century. And we let the students actually discover or figure it out what he or she consider by doing gap analysis will be one of the grand challenges. And then after that, that student will take that and move it forward in whatever way that he, she feels is appropriate and is capable of solving the problem. So I think that's very important, how to make each student feel ownership.
So let me continue with cool things. So it is for computational thinking, but then through coding. So when we started, we have MIT Professor Hao Abelson, and then we also have Education University of Hong Kong to work together with us. So basically, in the last 5-6 years, we have developed this curriculum, which is now already deployed and implemented by over 230 primary schools in Hong Kong. So this is about 60-70% of all the primary school population in Hong Kong. Fair to say, again, this program, particular curriculum, get international recognition. And I think the most powerful thing, like Rocky just mentioned, is not a sort of hardwire, you push it in their head kind of approach. It is really an approach to inspire students so that they think of a social issue to solve. Think about them. These are primary 4, 5, 6 students. But they would come up with ideas like, oh, my grandparents have difficulty calling taxi. So we're going to use coding to develop an app so that it will be easier for them to call taxi, for example. So very much self-generated social pain points, gap analysis, and then they have to develop a prototype, and then they can continue to sort of develop version 2, version 3. So to us, this is very much a very powerful way of engaging the students, even if they were just primary school students.
But I think we are actually just about to enter the Q&A session, and I have the questions here with me, so I'll ask. So there's a question, I think, from a audience online is asking, so this is addressed to Rocky.
Yeah.
So Mr. Bernard Chan said in the panel 1 that there's imminent problem of talent retention in Hong Kong. Do you agree? And what is the extent of the problem? And what can be done to avoid brain drain?
I mean, I can only speak from my university's vantage point, and at this moment, we don't see any issue with talent retention. We are, in terms of recruiting students, not a problem, and retaining faculty members, also not a problem. But that said, that doesn't mean it won't change, right? Anything in physics 101, you know that for something to move, you have either push or pull or both. So I think if we want to monitor or make sure that things only come in and not go out, we got to balance the push and pull. And likewise, if we want to keep status quo, we also have to balance the push and pull. So I do think that in terms of talent retention, at this moment, we don't see any problem. And I think actually the pandemic may, in fact, shake things up to such an extent that Hong Kong or any other place in the world may suddenly become more attractive. So at this moment, nothing to worry about. So just let the questioner know.
I believe we
Question
have a
about
meeting
the retention of talent in Hong Kong. Is that correct? I'm sorry, we dropped off for a minute.
Yes. So I think.
Okay. So, Rocky, I wonder if we can go back to you were making a point before we lost you on agency and motivation and problem solving, and I wanted to turn to Andreas. This is a theme that came up a lot with our laureates, that for kids to really learn well, they need to be somewhat in control of their learning agenda. They need to be able to connect what they're learning to their everyday problems or big challenges. You've been working on this at OECD too. Can you share a few of your thoughts with us?
Yeah, you know, that agency is really important, that empowerment over what I learn, how I learn, when I learn, where I learn. But it's not just the individual agency and problem solving. It is also, and I think Rocky pointed to this, the co-agency. Can I work with people who are different from me? Can I actually, you know, see the bigger picture? And I wanted to just give an example. In 2015, in our PISA assessment, we assessed collaborative problem-solving skills, not whether students can solve problems on their own, but whether they could, you know, share ideas, solve problems together, and so on. When we did that to students, you know, they were very puzzled. Well, we never were asked to do this in school, so how can we actually start? So some students took, you know, 15 minutes to figure out, you know, what a collaborative problem-solving exercise is. Which really shows we do not do a lot of project-based kind of collaborative learning activities where you develop that co-agency. When the results came out for teachers were puzzled and said, well, you know, why do we assess collaborative problem-solving skills? We are not, you know, teaching those kinds of skills. And when we showed those results to policymakers, we got the very same reaction. When I basically said, oh, all really nice, but, you know, shouldn't students first learn to solve problems on their own? And I think if we want to create a more collaborative culture in our societies, we have to start very, very early on. Those mindsets that are behind collaboration, that you see shared value, they're actually built very, very early on. And it was a really startling experience for us. That school is very much geared towards, you know, individual skills, individual problem-solving skills. And on the agency part, you see good examples. But on the more collaborative social parts, I think we are at the very beginning. We could learn a lot from kindergarten, actually. You know, often we think, you know, kindergarten, you know, we push school down to smaller children, but actually, you know, among the youngest children, we can see a lot of, you know, first initiative, creativity, agency, co-agency. And then in school, we sort of make people more compliant with established ways of thinking. We take things away. You know, no surprise that 15-year-olds, according to our assessment, are less creative than 10-year-olds. That's actually, you know, that is the reality. But I think we need to create deliberate and intentional spaces for students to collaborate, for teachers to collaborate. It's one of the hallmarks of high-performing education systems that you have, a combination of professional autonomy and a collaborative culture among teachers. But even at the system level, our schools all operate in isolation. They are not, knowing what's going to happen in the school down the street. So I think that is a systems questions that we really need to address.
And Sobi, I think with the kinds of challenges that you raise in your report, it's I can't even imagine solving them without kids that are engaged, creative, collaborating.
No, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, really the first recommendation in terms of pedagogies is around cooperation, collaboration, and solidarity. And interesting what you're saying, Andreas, on the collaborative problem solving, because a pedagogy of solidarity and cooperation is opposed to what we are, our established practices, which are individual learning trajectories. They are based on competition, grading, evaluation is competitive, selection, and ranking. So moving in that direction of more collaborative learning, more collaborative problem solving, would have a number of implications. And I'm thinking in particular assessment. Assessment of learning is always a strategic lever. And if we've, perhaps one of the innovations, if we may call it an innovation in what we've seen in some contexts in the past year and a half or over a year and a half, has been greater, importance or recognition of formative assessment. In the cases and out of necessity, in cases of summative and high stakes examinations, they have been replaced by continuous assessment. And I think assessment, if we are moving in the direction of collaborative, I'm thinking technology. With the digital divide, we're often thinking one learner, access to one device. But there's also innovation that can be had around group work and collaborative work around one connected device, and to move away from the logic, this individualized logic that we have in education, including in the way we are approaching very often the question of the digital divide. So I do think assessment, as a strategic lever, and introducing more collaborative forms of assessment would, have a domino effect in the way we teach and we organize learning and set up our learning environment.
Yeah, and I think physical.
Can I ask you?
Sorry, if I may just
go ahead.
very quickly. I agree to what you just said, and I just wanted that the physical environment sometimes also is very, very critical. So, for example, in the public schools in Hong Kong, students sit in rows, one row after another. So how do you encourage collaboration in that sense? Can you even change the physical environment so it's easier for students to work on projects? Can we change also outside of the classroom environment in school so that there are more areas or pockets of areas whereby students can work together on some other projects? So I think it is the virtual environment, but it is also the physical infrastructure as well.
One area that is actually doing quite well is often vocational education and skills. We treat it often as a last resort, but it should become a first choice in the 21st century because it's integrating the world of work and the world of learning. It helps people to work with real people, solve real problems, do things that have real consequences. And actually, I think it holds huge potential to develop precisely the kind of skills that we are talking about, that you do not develop when you sit in rows.
Totally agree. I think the experiential learning part is becoming even more and more relevant in the current world where people are facing all kinds of difficulties. So we're in our university, we're trying to build in pretty much to as many courses as possible an experiential learning component. It doesn't have to be a whole lot, but it has to be there. so that they can see, look, if I learn these things, some of them actually can be used for a particular situation. And it's all cumulative. I think if you just keep doing it, and then the students, again, we're looking for a better future, right? So these students will be, I was going to call them future citizens, but they're actually future villagers at this moment. And so they need to know what they have learned, how it can be applied to a real world setting. And that can only be done through experiential learning. And this is very, very important at this moment.
Young, I want to ask you one question. You have this tremendous influence with the Jockey Club, and it's this immense philanthropy or charitable giving that you give. How do you think of all this innovation and pedagogy and infrastructure and technology and dialogue with government? How do you see the role of philanthropy in supporting change?
Seems like a job interview for me, I guess. Huh? I think the way we look at things is, I used to work in a private equity world, so in the direct investment world. So I think the way we would say, we're almost looking at it as a philanthropist or as an investor, right? So you say, what are the issues that we try to address? What are the burning issues for the society, for the community? And then we then really decide or discuss on the potential theories of change. And then you deploy, I guess you deploy everything you have, whether it's technology, whether it's a certain kind of social innovation, whether it's through a series of partnership, with business, with academia, with the government, and etc. I think the beauty of the Hong Kong Jockey Club, in Hong Kong anyway, is that we are really a trusted platform. So we're not government, there's no political agenda. We are not NGOs, we don't need to raise funds. In fact, we bring money to the table. We are, we're not academia, with all due respect, Professor. We don't have the urge to publish papers, right? But then therefore, it somehow makes us a very good partner to work with. So I guess to us, as long as we keep an open mind, and be ready to deploy, all the different tools in hand and the cutting-edge tools globally available, then I think that's what we do day in and day out.
Thank you. Well, this has been a tremendously interesting panel, and I think we've taken it from the very high level right down to what do we need to do to promote change on the ground in Hong Kong, and how do we shape that dialogue going forward. And I want to thank our audience for their questions, and I want to thank our guests, our panelists, for so generously sharing their insights and their thoughts. You've helped us truly to imagine a better future for education and to understand the steps we need to take to get there. And Andreas, I want to give you a special thanks. You just walked off an airplane, I understand. And in fact, are doing this for us from the airport in Seoul. So a big round of applause and thank you to all of you. And congratulations on your report, Sophie, and everyone going forward. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.